Good day, everyone, and welcome to Unit 18, which is the Arguments and Evidence in Test Validation and Use. Before we proceed with our lesson proper, let's first define the arguments and evidence in test validation and use. When developing a language test developers need to present arguments or justifications for why their test is appropriate for its intended purpose. In the case of language testing, this involves explaining how the test measures what it claims to measure, like language proficiency, communication skills, etc., and whether it does so accurately. Evidence in the context of language test validation is the data and research that support the validity and reliability of the test. This includes empirical studies, statistical analysis, and other forms of data that demonstrate the test works as intended. Before we proceed with our lesson proper, let's first discuss the lesson outline. Actually, this unit has seven subtopics, but today I'll be only discussing the four subtopics because the remaining three subtopics will be discussed by the next reporter. So, our lesson outline, we have the 18.1, which is the introduction, 18.2, which is the argumentation as solution, 18.3, which is the form of an argument, and 18.4, which is the argument in evidence centered design. Cranbach and Mill 1955 argued for a view of validity that is based on a research program that collects evidence to support specific interpretations of test scores. The text explains why this approach is necessary. The first one, it allows the research community and other stakeholders to evaluate public claims about test scores. The second one, the evidence collected can strengthen confidence in a particular theory or interpretation. The third one, however, new evidence can also challenge and potentially render a theory obsolete. This perspective emphasizes continuous research and evidence collection to ensure that a test's validity is well supported and that interpretations of its results are open to scrutiny. This makes sure that test remains relevant and scientifically grounded with the flexibility to adapt if new evidence arises. Validity is a process of argument for the meaning and use of test scores. This process is fundamentally empirical and requires us not to only to seek evidence that supports intended or current test use, but also to investigate alternative interpretations of score meaning and test use. This is according to Misick 1989. It is this notion of presenting an argument and the collection of evidence to support that argument that provides a constant in the discussion of construct validity from the first introduction of the term in 1955 until the present. Stating that a score carries certain meaning or that a test can be used for an intended purpose is a claim that must be supported through the argument. Cranbank and Mill 1955 290 reproduced in Unit B1. Construct validation takes place when an investigator believes that his instrument reflects a particular construct to which are attached certain meanings. The proposed interpretation generates specific testable hypotheses which are a means of confirming or disconfirming the claim. In short, construct validation involves testing whether a measurement tool truly reflects the theoretical concept it is meant to assess, based on hypotheses that can be tested through evidence. Standards for Educational and Psychological Testing, Era et al. 1999 9. Validation can be viewed as developing a scientifically sound validity argument to support the intended interpretation of test scores and their relevance to the proposed use. The conceptual framework points to the kinds of evidence that might be collected to evaluate the proposed interpretation in light of the purposes of testing. In short, validation is about gathering evidence to ensure that test scores are interpreted correctly and used in a way that aligns with the test's goal. Validation is therefore a process, but it is also a process that does not stop. It is an activity that continues throughout the life of a test. When we make a claim about the meaning and use of a test, we are obliged to present a supporting argument. Validity research thus hopes to achieve two ends. Firstly, the reduction of doubt surrounding a claim. The trouble with aiming a truth is that you would not know when you had reached it, even if you had in fact reached it. But you can aim at ever more justification, the assuagement of ever more doubt. This is according to Rorty 1999 82. Rorty argues that we can never be sure we've found the truth, but we can work towards justifying our ideas more and more, gradually eliminating doubt and uncertainty. Secondly, the growth in assurance that a claim is justified so that the test use may continue for its stated purpose. There is no such thing as absolute certainty, but there is assurance sufficient for the purposes of human life. This is according to Mill 1859-24. Mill suggests that while we can never be absolutely certain about anything, we can still have enough assurance in our beliefs or claims to make decisions and move forward with them in everyday life. This level of confidence is sufficient for practical purposes. Dewey 1938 introduced warranted acceptability, linking inquiry to justifying claims. Tolman 2003 similarly examined the condition for asserting claims. True assertions depend on justificatory conditions rather than mere belief. Research favors plausible assertions backed by repeated investigations. Dewey's and Percy's views emphasize a probabilistic and empirical approach to claim validation. Tolman's model reflects these principles. Euler and Hinofotis 1980 presented two hypotheses. The first hypothesis, which is H1, claims that language skill is separable into components related either to linguistically defined categories or the traditionally recognized skills. H1 suggests that language skills can be broken into separate components, which may either align with linguistic categories, like grammar or vocabulary, or the traditional skills such as reading, writing, speaking, and listening. Hypothesis or H2 is that second language ability may be a more unitary factor such that once the common variance on a variety of language tasks is explained, essentially no meaningful unique variance attributable to separate components will remain. H2 suggests that second language ability may be a single unified factor, meaning that after accounting for the shared aspects of various language tasks, there won't be much distinct variance left to separate into different language components. Johnson and Tolman 1988 distinguish between substantial and analytic argument. Analytic arguments, these rely on internal principles and derive conclusions purely from premises, similar to syllogisms. Example, we have the premise 1, all humans are mortal. We have the premise 2, Socrates is a human. The conclusion, therefore Socrates is mortal. Substantial arguments. These require inference from evidence and must engage with specific empirical and temporal details. While substantial arguments are empirical, they do not lead to relativism. Instead, they align with a pragmatic approach. Example of substantial arguments. We have the premise 1. In a study of 500 students, those who practice English for 30 minutes a day scored 15% higher on language proficiency tests than those who practiced less than 10 minutes a day. We have the premise 2. Studies show that regular practice improves language retention and fluency. The conclusion, therefore, students who practice English for at least 30 minutes a day are likely to see improvement in their language proficiency. Tom in 1972 critiques both absolutist and relativist perspectives. He argues that absolutism avoids historical and anthropological complexities at the cost of irrelevance. Meanwhile, relativism, though acknowledging historical context, ultimately fails by rejecting any impartial standpoint for rational judgment. Kane 2001 329 has termed this approach validity as argument, following an earlier proposed by Cronbach 1988. In accordance with Kane, the process of developing a validity argument would proceed as follows. State an interpretive argument clearly, laying out the network of inferences leading from the test scores to the conclusion to be drawn and any decisions to be based on these conclusions. The validity argument is created by assembling all available evidence relevant to the inferences and assumptions in the interpretive argument. The most problematic assumptions in the argument are then evaluated, perhaps by investigating existing evidence or developing new lines of research. The argument is then restated in a more plausible form and further investigated or is rejected. Looking at validity as argument has a number of major advantages over other approaches to validity. The first is that validity arguments must relate to specific claims about the test's purpose and use, acknowledges that no test can be universally applied in all situations. For example, Swender 1999 claims that the applications of the OPI or oral proficiency interview are limitless in academic, professional, and research contexts. This suggests that the OPI is an effective tool for assessing language proficiency in various contexts, such as student evaluations, job qualifications, and linguistic studies, without significant limitations on its applicability. Cholhoff DeVille and Fulcher 2003 502 argue that a test that suits all purposes creates validation chaos. This means that when a single test is expected to meet too many different needs, it becomes difficult to ensure that it is valid and reliable for all of them. The second major advantage follows from this. As Kane 2001-331 puts it, a major strength of this argument based approach to validation is the guidance it provides in allocating research effort and in deciding on the kinds of validity evidence that are needed. The kinds of validity evidence that are most relevant are those that evaluate the main inferences and assumptions in the interpretive argument, particularly those that are the most problematic. The weakest parts of the argument are to be the focus of the analysis. This approach ensures that validation efforts are targeted and efficient by focusing on the most critical and potentially weak assumptions in a test interpretive argument. It prioritizes gathering evidence that strengthens these weak points, leading to a more reliable and well supported validation process. The third advantage is that this approach allows us to detect sleight of hand. It has become more and more common for test users to search for existing tests to fulfill new purposes for which they were not designed. These are off the peg solutions. These off the peg solutions may seem convenient but can lead to invalid conclusions if the test's original purpose doesn't align with its new application. Tolmin 2003-8 states that a sound argument, a well-grounded or firmly backed claim, is one which will stand up to criticism, one for which a case can be presented coming up to the standard required if it is to deserve a favorable verdict. This includes modal terms. These are words such as certainly, probably, may, or never. Tolman 2003 emphasizes that a strong argument is one that can withstand stand criticism and is supported by solid evidence. To be considered valid, an argument must meet the necessary standards of reasoning and justification, making it persuasive and defensible. In language testing, the criteria are generally agreed to be those laid out in the Standards Era 1999. The concept of force is therefore field invariant, whereas criteria are field dependent. Tolman 2003-36. This means that while the logic of argumentation stays the same, the standards used to judge validity vary by discipline. In language testing, force refers to the strength of an argument which remains consistent across fields, which is field invariant. However, criteria for evaluation depend on the specific field and its standards, which is field dependent. This means that while the logic of argumentation stays the same, the standards used to judge validity vary by discipline. The format has three basic components and three modifying components. Basic components consist of claim. The claim is the conclusion of the argument that we seek to justify. Grounds. The grounds are the facts, evidence, data, or information that we have available. Warrant. The warrant is the justification of the claim using the grounds. In other words, it is the link between the grounds and the claim. Modifying components, we have the backing. provides necessary support for the warrant such as theoretical models, research, or data. Model term indicates the strength or degree of certainty of the warrant. Rebuttal: a counterclaim that challenges the warrant, often citing issues like construct irrelevant variance or underrepresentation in specific contexts. Example: language testing. We have here the figure A10.1 provides the basic form of an argument as outlined by Tolman 2003-97. We have the G, which is the grounds. The arrow signifies that the argument moves from grounds, which is evidence or data, to a conclusion. The MTC, which is the claim, the conclusion is reached based on the provided grounds. Since W, the warrant is the reasoning or principle that justifies moving from the ground to the conclusion. On account B or backing supports the warrant, strengthening the argument. Unless or R rebuttal. Rebuttal represents possible exceptions or counter arguments that could challenge the claim. Tolman's argument model is applied here to claim that Harry is a British citizen. The components of the argument are: claim, Harry is a British subject; grounds, Harry was born in Bermuda; warrant, people born in Bermuda are typically British citizens; backing, laws regarding the nationality of individuals born in British colonies support the warrant. Rebuttal: Harry may not be a British citizen if both his parents were aliens. He naturalized as a citizen of another country. It is shown here in Figure 810.2 the argument of Harry's nationality. Tolman Abed 96 makes it clear that a Bermudan will be, in the eyes of the law, a Breton. A, a whale will be, example, is classifiable as a mammal. A Saudi Arabian will be found to be a Muslim. Tolman Ibid 98 explicitly states that warrants are hypothetical bridge-like statements that are the focus of an argument. Tolman does not explicitly reference pragmatism. His approach aligns with its principles, particularly in ethics. Truth, so far as it can be established, is not the property of a belief, which here a claim, or the facts, here the ground or data, but rather the link between them, which is here the warrant. Tolman's approach aligns with pragmatism by emphasizing that truth is not just in a claim or its supporting facts, but in the logical connection between them, the warrant. This means an argument's strength depends on how well the reasoning justifies the claim based on evidence. Tolman's approach to argument is also at the center of evidence centered design, or ECD, as discussed in Unit A5, Ms. Levitt 2003A and 2003B. Ms. Libby 2003A 12 provides an example of how this could be operationalized in an English test, which we adapt in Figure 18.3. We have here the Figure 18.3 Ms. Livy's language testing example. We have here a scenario 1. So successful essay. Premise: Sue's essay effectively uses three incidents to illustrate Hamlet's indecisiveness. We have here the reasoning. This is possible because students have been taught how to select and use examples to support general points, and they can apply this skill in their writing. The connection is shown by the words since and on account of. We have heard the scenario too. Sue's potentially plagiarized essay. We have the premise. Sue can use specific examples to illustrate a fictional character. We have the condition. This is true unless the essay is plagiarized, meaning it's too similar to a well known guide to Hamlet. The word unless indicates a conditional relationship. So the example highlights how a student's ability to use examples effectively can be differentiated from plagiarism. A student who understands how to support a point with relevant examples will likely to write an original essay. Conversely, an essay that closely mirrors a known source suggests plagiarism, regardless of the quality of the examples used. The diagram visually represents the logical connections between these ideas. So that would be all for my discussion for today. I hope you can get useful knowledge from this presentation.